So we're going to have, how science books drive public discussion. I still haven't got trust in there. So how do science books drive public discussion and thus affect trust relationships among society? You notice that I have not said between science and society. I am operating from the general assumption, belief that science is thoroughly integrated in society, and that what we're talking about are a series of interrelationships that are at stake. Now, one of the first things that get asked when you're talking about books in this era where we're all internet connected, I see someone over here connected up to the web, and there's wireless networks all around, why study books? Why should we care about books at all? And the fundamental point is that books, at least in the 20 or in the 50 years after World War II, and based on last Friday's Nobel Peace Prize announcement up to and including 2007, books still have a function. Maybe books linked to other media, as Al Gore's book is linked to his to the movie and DVD on An Inconvenient Truth, but books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which are symbolically linked to the environmental movement. We can have long historical arguments about whether it really is the start of the environmental movement, but clearly gets constructed that way as being part of the social discussion. The responses from other kinds of perspectives, the skeptical environmentalist, Bjorn Lomborg's book from a few years ago, and then things like Al Gore's book, these become sparks of public discussion. They become a place where discourse about issues that involve science, technology, environment, risk, uncertainty, all that cluster of issues all come in together. So that, if you ask a scientist today, how many scientists do we have? People who would call themselves scientists in the room. Okay, how many journalists do we have in the room? You. How many museum people? How many academics? Yeah, okay. I realize there's some overlap in those categories, but if you ask scientists, well, what role do books play in science in the years after World War II? For the most part, they'll say, well, no role. If it's not in a journal, it's not real science. And yet, it's clear that books like this continue to be linked to science and continue to be a big part of what the scientific community engages with, as well as the public community. So that leads us to have to think a little bit about what is the system of science communication that we want to be thinking about. And people often think about it in this very linear way, right? There's stuff that happens in the lab or out in the field, depending on what kind of work you do. And you go present some of those results at meetings, and some of it goes off in preprints and gets circulated. And eventually it gets published in a formal paper, peer-reviewed paper in a journal, and then it's science, right? And only after that does it go out to the mass media or to textbooks or to policy documents or things like that. In fact, it takes relatively little work to show that it's a lot messier, right? And I've just realized that I want to have my pointer. Hang on. Forgot to prepare for that. I'm enough of a scientist that I have a laser pointer in my bag. That, in fact, although there is that lab and field work that goes to journals, that goes out to the news media, there's also the lab work goes to the research news, which might go directly into a general kind of book. Things go from journals into textbooks, and from there into policy documents. But there's also stuff that goes here to seminars, and from there maybe it gets picked up by a museum curator. Of course, a lot of the work is done at museums, so there's back and forth arrows there. Al Gore's book, there's stuff in there that comes out of the lab and field. He shows pictures from there. It goes into a documentary. I could draw a link between there and there. You'll notice that I've called that the web of science communication. There's some versions of this diagram where I came up with this idea just before the World Wide Web was developed. And so now I tend to refer to it as the sphere of science communication, and I have sort of an X, Y, Z axis in there. But the main point is that it's not a simple linear process. Information flows in lots of ways. And so if we start thinking about where books are, books can feed back into the research process and into policy issues and so on. And so we really want to think about books in this much more complicated kind of way. In no way do I want to imply that this is a formal model that one could assign weights to these arrows or anything like that. The second issue that we want to, sort of general big conceptual issue, is that books are largely out, the kinds of books I'm going to be talking about today are largely ones that are out in general public, is to think about what kinds of functions do those books play. And for this, we have to think about models of science communication. And so I'm leaving aside for now, it turns out there are lots of places where you can look at books in science. There's textbooks, there's reference books, there's conference proceedings. As Phil was saying this morning, that's a whole other set of talks. But if I think just about public communication, we can think about these different models of what are we trying to do when we're engaging in communication among society, but subgroups within, between scientists and the public. And the traditional model is referred to as the deficit model. This is the idea that the public doesn't know anything, they have a deficit of knowledge, all we have to do is pour in knowledge, and then the problem, whatever the problem was, will be solved. That in interesting ways that still happens and may be necessary, but many of the people who study public understanding of science critique that and instead point to these other models, things like a contextual model, which is let's pay attention to the fact that people are interested in topics that are particularly relevant to them. So medicine goes in one ear and out the other ear until somebody in your family has that disease, and suddenly you pay attention to it. Stuff about radon and radiation and geology you don't pay attention to until you're buying a new house and you do a radon test and discover there's radon in the basement of the house you're trying to buy. All of a sudden you pay attention. What do we know about that? That's the contextual model. The lay knowledge model recognizes that people have expertise of their own, and I think Jill mentioned earlier the AIDS patients who know a lot about not only the science, but about their own experience and the relevance of their own experience to making some complex medical decisions. And so they're bringing their own expertises. And then a public participation model, which is the sort of pure democratic idea. Science is part of a democratic society. Part of what makes our society function is the open discussion that is common to science and to democracy. So I'm drawing on Mertonian norms here, another common theme. But most people don't realize that in the public participation model, taken to its strongest form, is about turning over authority over science and science decisions to a broad, to outside the scientific community. Many people will talk about public participation as a sort of advisory tool for scientists. That's not what it means in its most comprehensive form. I don't think Sheila's come yet, but in a talk she gave a few weeks ago in New York, she referred to two models of science communication. One that she called the public service model, which is pretty much those first two. It's the idea that scientists have an obligation to provide information. And then a second model, which she called the public sphere model, which is much more the latter two, this sense of public discussion and integration into the process. So what do books, given those sort of broad conceptual things of the web and these different models, what then can we tell us, do books tell us about public issues? And I've argued already, they are part of the web, you see them all over the place. Precisely because of all those interconnections, they can play multiple roles. And ultimately what I think they do is they become vessels or places or for the integration of science and the rest of culture. So now for a bit more detail of sort of, how can I make this claim? I want to focus on intellectual and public discourse, or chattering class in public discourse if you're British, I guess. We don't really use that label in the US anyway. Do they use it in Canada, chattering classes? I see.
Depends which circles.
Depends which circles. I know.
Among the chattering classes.
Among the chattering classes, they do, right, okay. So what I did to try to identify books that are here is I looked at things that have won Pulitzer Prizes in the years after World War II. I'm not going to show the data today, but also National Book Awards. I've looked at bestseller lists, both New York Times and Publishers Weekly lists. I've also used sending letters to people and saying, so tell me, what were the important books that you remember about how you became a scientist, or that you think of as major books? And I started to say scouring, and then I realized, well, dipping in and sort of skipping across some of the public debates about trying to identify books. So what do we find? So these are Pulitzers after World War II through 1990. In a minute, I'll show another slide going beyond it. The important thing to notice here is that there's one book immediately after World War II, Baxter's Scientists Against Time, which was a history of the use of science in World War II. Getzmann's Exploration and Empire, which was sort of about U.S. Conquest of the West. Basically, in the first 20 years, first 30 years after the war, only those two. Then, starting in 1978 with Sagan's Dragons of Eden, almost every year or every other year, a science book or some kind of science-related book wins a Pulitzer Prize. And that continues right up about to 2000. It's not a perfect kind of measure, but there's something different that seems to have happened. And it's not simply, I've checked in, does it have to do with the categories that were used in the Pulitzers or things like that? No, there's some increase in the kinds of books. And it's a real range of books. Let's see. If you look at these, we have things, Soul of a New Machine, which is about computers. We've got Social Histories of Medicine, Social Histories of the Space Race, Hofstadter's Gödel Bach, which is, I'm not sure what you would call that. But none of these can I sort of really quickly, easily say, well, they're obviously about trust. They're part of a general discussion. Same, if I look at these, maybe Larson's History of Summer for the Gods, which is a history of the Scopes trial. Maybe that one involves some kind of trust issues, but these are not books which are sort of clearly addressing those concerns. If I look at bestsellers, this data is number of science-related books that get added to the weekly New York Times bestseller list from 1945 to 2000. You can see it's pretty noisy data, goes up and down, goes up and down, but there's an inflection point of some kind right here in the late 1970s. Before 1975, there's almost never a year when there are more than 10 new books added to the list. After 1975, there's almost never a year when there are fewer than 10 added to the bestseller list. There's some kind of change, and it's, again, we've gone back to look and make sure, was it just sort of a change in the way they counted or the things they listed? No, there's some kind of change that happened there. And I really want to highlight that shift because the late 1970s, so we've seen it already in the Pulitzer Prize books, we see it in the list of bestsellers. I can see it if I move away from books. This is new magazines, newspaper science sections, and television shows about science, new ones. So this is all the pre-1950 stuff, which is only magazines. And then we get, some rise. So these are 5-year periods. See some rise until the late 1970s. So that's 75 to 80, and then 80 to 85, or 75 to 79, 80 to 85. The data only goes up through about 87, so I don't really, I can't push it, but I know just, even without systematically doing it, I can tell you there's a big drop after that. And a big chunk of it is tied to these science newspaper sections about science, but there's also this rise in science television, news shows about that. There's, again, we see this, something happening in the late 1970s. that changes the character of the public interaction with science. I'm going to come back to that, try to see if we can figure out why, but I just want to highlight it now. What kinds of books became bestsellers? There are those that are sort of science as science. Most of those Pulitzer Prize winners sort of fall into that category. They're about physics or chemistry or biology or something. And then there's what a category that we're loosely calling public science. This is sex, inspirational things, books about medicine, diet, health, fitness. Actually a few humor books in there as well. This is shaky data. I don't want to push on it too much because how we classify these books is a problem. But I just want to highlight that if we're talking about what the public sees as science, at least as we see it through books, it's very different from thinking about chemistry, physics, biology. It's a much broader range of thinking. If I look at specific bestsellers to see what they are, you'll see, first off, there's a bunch of the sex ones, the Kinsey books, Masters and Johnson, Sherry Height's National Survey of Female Sexual Life. I'm not going to make any statements about whether these are good science, right? I'm highlighting the topics. We've got Exploration, Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki, Rachel Carson's See Around Us. It's often forgotten that Rachel Carson was a best-selling author long before Silent Spring came out. It was actually part of what gave her the authority to be able to do that book. And then Sagan's Dragons of Eden in 1977. And that then brings us to the fall of 1980 when Cosmos comes out. I mean, the interesting thing about this, first off, so I teach at Cornell, right? I teach at the institution where he was famous, right? In my class last semester of 60 undergraduates who are taking a class in science communication, I said, who's Carl Sagan? Four people knew. Everyone in this room is getting older, right? Which is a good thing in some ways. But, I'm doing history here, and history is often not what, even those things that are recent for us are not what people are thinking of today. So the 25th edition has come out of this. Obviously, this was tied to a TV show. One of the interesting aspects of this is that the book was a separate text from the TV show, although it's tied to it. The show was explicitly modeled on Bronowski's Ascent of Man, in which the book version is literally the script of the show published. Cosmos becomes hugely successful. On the basis of that, Sagan gets a contract for a novel, which at the time was the largest advance for an unwritten fiction book that anybody had received. If we go beyond 80, we've got Sagan. We're going to look at Brief History of Time for a second, Hawking's book. One of the things to notice is that after about 1990, all of those first books had been in the top 10. There's a change in the book publishing industry after about 1990, where bestsellers are comic books and cookbooks. They're no longer what Publishers Weekly calls reading books. So the science books move way down on the list, but that's partly a function of changes in the book industry. Again, with the exception maybe of this year, where we've got Preston's Hot Zone, which was about Ebola, and Herrnstein and Murray's Bell Curve, I'm not seeing trust come up in a lot of these. Is that agreement or disagreement? Here's the classic science, popular science book, Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, which sold millions of copies. Whether it was read or not is one of the great questions in the public understanding of science world, and so on. But it clearly sort of changed the dynamics of what goes on. Okay, so having given you all that data, let me try to say what do I think, what kinds of discussions do I think get driven by these books? I think there are four areas. One is discussion of the developments within science itself, of intellectual developments. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these. A second one is recruitment. A lot of the science book writers will tell you they write them because they want young kids to be excited about science the way they are, so that there will be a flow of scientists, of young scientists there. What Culture scientifique, there's no way to translate this into English. Everybody keeps trying, but it's not popularization, it's not public science. And here in Canada, at least you have bilingualism, you understand this problem. Some sense of a culture in which science is interwoven with the daily aspects of culture. And then finally, public debate. So by intellectual development, the kinds of things I'm talking about are things like Wilson's Sociobiology, Weizenbaum's Computer Power Human Reason, Glick's Chaos. These are books which were partially written for broad audiences, but partially written for colleagues or the extended professional community, where they were trying to make arguments that were too big to make in journal articles. Obviously, the Weizenbaum and the Wilson are written by, maybe not obviously, again, I'm making assumptions here about what people know. Wilson and Weizenbaum were both written by professionals, leaders within the field. Glick's Chaos is written by a science journalist, but many people date the sort of creation of the field of chaos to it in the sense that it coalesced something that was there already, and it made many people see the connections between their work. Recruitment. If you go to scientists of a certain age, at this point over about 70, and say, what made you want to be a scientist? Every one of them will tell you, no matter what kind of science they're in, they'll tell you, I read de Cruyff's Microbe Hunters when I was a kid. If you go to a middle range, those between 40 and 70, say, why did you become a scientist? I read Watson's Double Helix. I thought, that's cool. I want to be able to change the world and then go play tennis. And chase girls or boys, There's a set of people, sort of the 25 to 40 range, for whom seeing Cosmos and reading and then going and getting the book was part of it. There doesn't seem to be one since Cosmos. I haven't found something when I ask my students, I'm not getting a sort of common thing. There's some TV shows. It's Bill Nye the Science Guy. But there may be some change here, but these books played a tremendously important recruitment role. In terms of the culture scientifique, I'm thinking about things like Eiseley's books, Asimov. I don't know what to do with Asimov. There's so many, there's 400 Asimov books. It's important to remember that Asimov's popular science was written while he had writer's block, right? So he wrote the Foundation series in the early to mid 1950s. And then, so his science fiction, and then he couldn't come up with any more stories. He lost that imaginative thing. He couldn't stop writing, and so he just churned out all these popular science books. And eventually, toward the end of his life, he wrote a few more fictional books. But to come back to this sort of culture scientifique, Bronowski, Lewis Thomas's Lives in a Cell, David Sobel's Longitude. These were books that the chattering classes had to have read, right? If you were someone who claimed to be au courant with what's happening, you had read these books. And then finally, there's the public debate books. So Conant's On Understanding Science, Carson, Dawkins' Selfish Gene, linked again to Wilson's Sociobiology, Keller's Feeling for the Organism, the End of Nature book, The Bell Curve, and then those are just the covers of them. And then, according to the Nobel Committee, An Inconvenient Truth. I'm fascinated by Gore's winning the prize. As a science studies, science communication person, I'm fascinated by this. The lecture that I had to totally retape over the weekend so that I could leave it for my students for this morning's class was about the Nobel Prize Peace Prize has just gone for communication. It wasn't about some other kind of it. It's about science communication. There's something really interesting there, but I haven't had time to think about it. Okay, so what do these things have in common? Since I'm probably down to about my 1 minute note. Many of these books, especially the public debate ones, are tied to some of these big, broad political issues. Political movements like environmentalism, Keller's Feeling for the Organism, tied to feminism, the Lewenstein and Murray book, tied to discussions of racism. They were on one side, but... and the thing that I think is really interesting, and here I'm pushing way past my data, there's a deep tension that a lot of these books highlight between an authoritarian view of the world and a sort of democratic question authority kind of view. Do we trust science as being, do we trust inquiry, do we trust questioning, or are we looking for an authority? And there's some suggestion that some of the changes, the rise of creation science in the 60s and 70s, the development of a sort of conservative Christian movement, the development of a conservative political movement in the United States at least, but actually in other countries as well in the 60s and 70s. The reaction against the 60s is partly a reaction against questioning authority. It's a preference for authority. It's a preference for somebody else making the decisions, and then you just have to follow along. So there's some evidence that this is tied to broad cultural shifts, which is why I keep highlighting that late 70s. You know, I can explain some of the late 1970s by saying, well, it's a demographic bulge. The baby boomers come of age in the late 1970s. They discover disposable income, and so they buy magazines. This is the first generation that's been educated in the post-Sputnik era. But there's something else going on as well, because it shows up in too many places. This question of the trust and authority, there's some alignment of the scientific community with liberal democratic values, which we saw in the resistance to Ronald Reagan's Star Wars and to the current Union Concerned Scientists leading the campaign against the use of science or misuse of science in the current administration, recognizing the caveats that Phil gave us this morning about Chris Mooney's book, Republican War on Science. And we also have to recognize that that's, you know, a gross oversimplification, that there are a tremendous number of politically conservative scientists. There are plenty of scientists who participate, as we heard this morning, in authority-driven contexts of science. So I'm not going to, I don't want to push this argument any further. So I'm just going to conclude by saying that, you know, how do books drive discussion? I think they're part of this web of all of the different ways that people communicate about science. They do provide information. They also bring these new perspectives in, and they can stimulate discussion. And ultimately what they're doing is they're creating this culture, this interweaving of science and public issues. Thank you very much.